Hello everyone and welcome back. We're going to look at radial filters today, especially when we use them to edit our subject and our background separately. We often want to do that, especially when there's not a lot of depth of field. You've got a blurry background, you've got a sharp subject. Your edits, according to your background and your subject, need to be completely different. So this is quite a nifty technique to do just that. I hope you enjoy. So like we said before, we want to edit our background and our subject separately. And if you look at this image, it's got a narrow depth of field. Our lioness in the cub in her mouth is very sharp, where the background is very blurry. Now this is horribly composed. In these moments, you never know when a lioness is all of a sudden going to pick up a cub. It's a very rare moment. It's something we all dream of as photographers and safari goers. So in this moment, my focus point was on the wrong side of the frame. In the time that I would have taken to move that focus point on the gear that I used to have back then to the other side of the frame, I would have missed this moment. She might have been looking away or looking down or dropped the cub or done something, and I would have missed that moment. So I did the best I could in the moment, and I just took the picture knowing that I could recompose it at a later stage. If you've got time, rather do it in the camera. I would have rather have stayed back in this image and had a little bit more space to work with. But like I said, I'm never just going to do perfect images. We're not going to learn that way. So we're going to use radial filters to edit this. Firstly, I'm going to fix my composition, as I always say. All of these cubs here are non-essential elements. They could have been more interesting. I was on a fixed focal length. I couldn't really fit more of them in. But in this situation, I have to use minimalism and I have to use engagement. These are my most powerful tools to create the most out of this image. Perspective, I couldn't really change. If you hold your camera out the car with a lion, they can react poorly. It's very unethical. So I couldn't really change my perspective, but I can eliminate non-essential elements and I can focus on engagement and confrontation here, because the lioness is looking at us. There's a lot of interesting things going on here. She's got a cub in her mouth. I want my viewer to focus on that. So let's fix our composition. Cut out all these cubs. We don't want these cubs here, so we crop in. Now, as you can see, this cub in the bottom right corner here is slightly irritating. And like I've said before, because there's an eye in that image, we connect with eyes, which makes that very distracting. So I've got to actually get rid of that whole cub. But as you can see, if I get rid of the whole cub, I actually start to get rid of this cub's tail that's in her mouth. You might say, no, that's not good. You can't cut that cub's tail out. In some ways, they're right. There's a few ways around this. We could go into a portrait like this and cut that cub out and go something along these lines. Now I've left my composition grid on symmetry. I want to bring that back to the rule of thirds. And now I want to focus on my edits. And now, like I said, the background, the blurry background, is helping frame our subject. It's helping draw our viewer onto our subject. It's doing us favors. So we want to have different edits to our background and our lioness. Firstly, there's a little bit of an imbalance here. I would like a little bit more space on the side of the frame. But if I open that side of the frame, you can see I start to let in this little cub's tail. Now that might seem insignificant, but it's actually a significant problem. It holds a lot of visual mass, especially when if you print something like this big, the viewer is going to be distracted about that. It's quite obscure. So this is when the spot removal tool comes in handy. I can brush over that, and because there's lots of areas that are similar, you can see that little cub's tail is now gone, and we're ready to start editing. So now we get onto our radial filter technique. I can put two radial filters, one over our lioness. If I click O, you can see where the mask is. So you can see in red, that's where my edits are going to be applied. And like I said before, I want to have different edits on my lion's face and the cub. That's my subject compared to the background. So what I can do is duplicate this, make two of them, come down here and make sure invert is not ticked. That'll reverse it to editing inside the circle and editing outside the circle. So now I've got two radial filters, one that's editing outside of the circle and one that's editing inside the circle. Now some people might say I must brush away this mask to make it exactly over the lion's face. Sometimes you're right, but quite often I disagree. If those edits overlap with a nice feather, it actually blends much more easy in a much more natural way. So quite often I won't mask it out. And what I mean by that is when you're selected on a radial filter, you have this option here to brush. And if I hold the brush over here and I hold Alt, I can brush away areas of this red and make it more exact. If I hold Command, it will auto mask. So if I go along a line like this lioness's forehead over here, it will try and stay along that line, brushing areas away above it, but keeping her head selected. Now, I don't think this is necessary for this image. So I'm going to Command Z and undo all of that. I don't mind if these edits blend with each other and overlap. I think it's going to be much more natural that way. So let's look at editing our line first. We click O to take the edits off. I like to do this instinctually and add the edits as I go and see how much it needs. A little bit of clarity, I've cropped in a bit. A little bit of texture somewhere on there, and a little bit of contrast on my lion's face. Again, remember, people often add contrast globally. You must be careful of that, because global contrast can add a sense of clarity to the background, and we don't want that, because that's helping push our subject towards our viewer. So I've done about enough on the lion's face. I don't need too much more. So I click done, and now I'll go to the background, which is the one on the right over here. If I hover over it, you can see in red, that's where I'm editing. And now I can do a few little tricks here. I can maybe make it a little bit more blurrier. I can down the clarity and down the texture. Now it's even a little bit more blurrier. I was shooting this at f5.6. Now it almost looks like I was shooting it at f2.8. Remember, if I had shot it on f2.8, the problem comes, if I was focusing on the eyes, that cub is just a little bit closer to me than the eyes. I would have had a blurry club. I would have had a blurry cub. I would have had a blurry cub, and I would have been devastated, because that cub is so important in the scene. This is why I keep telling people who have f2.8 lenses, these high-end lenses. It is beautiful, but you will kick yourself in the foot when you're in a situation like this and you shoot at f2.8 and that cub is not in focus. So beware of that. But now, by adding a radial filter, I've allowed to take away a bit of clarity and a bit of texture from the background. So it's almost like I did shoot it at f2.8, but I still have the details on my cub. And now I can also take down a little bit of exposure, just a touch. All these small changes add up to a really big difference. So it might not look like much now, but it adds up at the end of the day. And I click done, and there we go. I've used radial filters, and I've done my edits on my line, and I've done my edits on my background, which deserve to be different in this case. Like I've said before, I always like to end with a global edit, even if it's very subtle, because we've edited the face differently and we've edited the background differently. This helps even out those edits. So I go down into my tone curve. This is where I like to do it. And I just drop the shadows just a touch. This is a nice way of adding global contrast. And now that you're adding it globally, not selectively, like we've done with the radial filters, it helps all those edits come together and finish the image off. If I look at the before and after, you can see we've got nice smooth contrast. That light's coming through nicely. It's nice and beautiful. Background slightly blurrier, and that's the joy of using radial filters to edit your subject and your background separately. The next image we're going to look at is gorillas. Now gorillas are a perfect example of using radial filters to edit your background separately and your gorilla separately, your subject separately, because gorillas are often heavily contrasted with what's going around them. They're very dark, the light's behaving differently with them as to leaves. Leaves are reflecting light and catching a lot of light. So your edits can never be the same with your background and your subject. You really have to get localized and get specific with it. So let's have a look at this image. Like I've always said, you've got to fix your composition before you fix anything. To be honest, I quite like this composition. I'm not going to fix anything here. Exactly as it is exactly how I want it. But there is some problems. My gorilla is very dark, the leaves are very bright. There's a strong conflict in what I want my viewer to look at. So I want to bring brightness to my gorilla's face, and I want to bring darkness to the leaves, and in fact desaturate them. The greens are a little bit heavy for my liking. So we get our radial filter, we put one over our gorilla's face like this. We're editing the gorilla, and we put another one over a slightly bigger area, a little bit more of the shoulders over there, and I click invert off. My invert, because I often invert my radial filters, is automatically clicked on. Yours will likely come as a standard clicked off. So click it on and off, it does the same thing. So if I click O, this radial filter is affecting outside of my gorilla, and this radial filter is affecting my gorilla's face. So let me deal with the background first. Which one you deal with first is up to you, it doesn't really make a difference. I click O off, and the first thing I want to do is take a little bit of exposure away. Make what's happening around the gorilla a little bit darker. So the first thing I want to do is take a little bit of exposure away. What's happening around the gorilla is a little bit too bright for my liking. And you can see there's some very bright leaves here, particularly bright leaves. If I want to target those leaves specifically, I can grab the highlights, take the highlights down. You can see it's affecting those leaves. And I can go the whole way if I like. I can even take the whites and still make these leaves over here less bright, less of an impact. They're holding less visual mass. And like I said, the greens are a little bit too bright for me. So I might come into saturation and just drop the saturation down on those greens a little bit. They're a little bit softer now. They're holding a little bit too much mass with their color. And now I'm done with the background. And now I'm done with what's framing the gorilla, the foreground and the background. Now I want to deal with my subject specifically. I click on the one that's doing my gorilla's face, and I do a few things here. Obviously we want to lift the exposure a little bit, but the exposure slider on its own sometimes makes quite an uneven, unnatural appearance, although I'm pretty sure I'm going to have to use it here anyway. But I like to start with the shadows. I lift the shadows, it's much more natural. It doesn't really move the highlights around a little bit, so there's a little bit more contrast on your subject's face. So I go to the point where I'm quite happy with the shadows, somewhere around there, and just a touch of exposure, a few decibels. That's way too much. Let's go to +3. Somewhere around there, I'm going to make this a little bit bigger. Somewhere over there. And now I've lifted the exposure to where I want it to be. But when you lift exposures, like I said before, sometimes you can remove a bit of contrast and clarity from your subject's face. So I want to add those back in. So I come down to texture and clarity, and I add a little bit of clarity and just a touch of texture and maybe even a bit of global contrast over that area. We've gone from a horribly exposed image, by using radial filters, we've actually come out with something quite pretty. Our gorilla's face is exposed correctly, and we've taken away all that visual mass that the bright greens and bright luminosity of the frame around it had. So as you can see, using a double radial filter, one to edit your subject and one to edit your background, is very useful at separating those edits and coming out with a very beautiful image. It's a very powerful way, because remember, your background and your foreground often need different edits to your subject itself. It's a worthwhile trick. Sometimes you have to do more, sometimes you use 3 or 4 filters, but that's a very simple way of making a very powerful edit. I hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you for the next one.